Picture this. April 2024, outskirts of Salt Lake City, Utah. A massive real estate development project is transforming what was once a stretch of forgotten highway businesses into modern condominiums and commercial space. Among the structures slated for demolition is the Desert Rose Motel, a decaying relic from the 1950s that's been abandoned since the mid-1990s, its pink stucco walls crumbling, its neon sign long since dark, a ghost of Utah's mid-century boom years. On April 15, 2024, a demolition crew is clearing the lot behind the old motel, excavating deep to prepare for underground parking. The operator of a massive excavator, a man named Carlos Mendoza, is digging through layers of packed earth and debris when his bucket strikes something that shouldn't be there. The impact reverberates through the machine differently than rock or concrete. He backs off, repositions, and takes another careful scoop. This time, he sees it. A flash of red paint, corroded chrome, the unmistakable curve of a car's fender. Within hours, the site is swarmed with police, forensic teams, and investigators. What emerges from 12 feet of Utah soil is a 1963 Plymouth Fury, once bright red, but now faded and rusted, buried upright as if it had been driven into a pit and covered. The license plate, though corroded, is still readable. Utah 4H7293. And in the trunk, sealed and preserved by the dry desert soil, are human remains that have been there for 61 years. That license plate, when checked against decades-old DMV records painstakingly preserved in state archives, tells a story that has haunted Salt Lake City for 6 decades. The car belonged to Andrew Johnson, a 31-year-old insurance salesman who left a business meeting on October 12, 1963, drove away in his pride and joy, that brand-new Plymouth Fury, and was never seen again. His disappearance devastated his young family, baffled investigators, and became one of Utah's most enduring cold cases. If you're drawn to mysteries where the earth literally gives up its secrets, where progress uncovers crimes that were meant to stay hidden forever, then subscribe right now. Hit that button, because what I'm about to tell you is a story of ambition, betrayal, and murder that was buried for 61 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this discovery has reopened questions about organized crime in 1960s Utah, about a motel that may have been more than it seemed, and about how many other secrets might be buried beneath the American West. The question isn't just who killed Andrew Johnson. The question is, who had the resources and the audacity to bury an entire car 12 feet underground and keep that secret for more than 6 decades? Andrew Johnson was 31 years old in the fall of 1963, a man who embodied the optimistic ambition of post-war America. Standing at 6 feet tall with an athletic build maintained through weekend basketball games and evening jogs around his neighborhood, Andrew had the kind of presence that filled a room. He had thick, dark hair that he kept neatly styled with pomade, warm brown eyes that conveyed sincerity, and a smile that people trusted instinctively. That smile was his greatest professional asset. His hands were always moving when he talked, gesturing to emphasize points, drawing invisible charts in the air when explaining insurance policies, reaching out to shake hands with a grip that was firm but never aggressive. He wore a wedding ring that he'd bought with his first commission check, a simple gold band that he'd tap absently when he was thinking. His suits were always pressed, his shoes always shined, his tie always perfectly knotted. In the insurance business, Andrew understood, appearance mattered almost as much as the product you were selling. Born in 1932 in Provo, Utah, Andrew had grown up during the Depression and the war years, watching his father struggle to keep the family fed through difficult times. Those early years had instilled in him a hunger for financial security and success that drove everything he did. He'd worked his way through the University of Utah, graduating in 1954 with a degree in business, and immediately entered the insurance industry, seeing it as a path to the middle class. Prosperity he'd always wanted. By 1963, Andrew worked for Mountain States Insurance, one of the largest insurance companies in the Intermountain West. He specialized in life insurance and business policies, selling primarily to small business owners across the Salt Lake Valley. He was good at it, very good. In 1962, he'd been the company's top salesman, earning enough in commissions to buy that Plymouth Fury and start seriously planning for his family's future. His typical day started early. Andrew would wake at 6 a.m. in the modest ranch-style house he and his wife Carol had purchased in the Murray suburb of Salt Lake City. 3 bedrooms with a small backyard and a garage where he kept the Plymouth pristine. He'd have coffee and read the Salt Lake Tribune while Carol made breakfast. By 7:30 a.m., he'd be on the road, visiting clients or prospecting new ones, armed with his briefcase full of policy documents and his infectious enthusiasm for helping people protect their futures. Carol Johnson had married Andrew in 1957, a whirlwind romance that began when she was a secretary at the insurance company, and he was a young salesman with big dreams. She was 28 in 1963, a slender woman with auburn hair styled in the fashionable bouffant of the era, green eyes, and a quick wit that balanced Andrew's sometimes overwhelming intensity. She'd left her job after their son was born, focusing on homemaking and raising their child, though she occasionally helped Andrew with paperwork and filing. Their son, Michael, was 3 years old in 1963, an energetic boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Andrew adored him, would come home from even the longest days and spend an hour playing with Michael before dinner, building towers of blocks, reading picture books, making the boy laugh with silly voices and exaggerated facial expressions. Andrew had plans for Michael's future, a college fund he was building, dreams of giving his son opportunities he'd never had. What made Andrew special in the competitive world of insurance sales was his genuine care for his clients. He wasn't just selling policies. He was building relationships, understanding people's needs, crafting solutions that actually protected families and businesses. His clients trusted him, referred him to friends and relatives, came back to him when their needs changed. By late 1963, Andrew had built a client base of over 200 accounts, making him one of the most successful salesmen in the Mountain States office. But success brought complications. Andrew was earning significant commissions, sometimes $1,500 a month, in an era when the average salary was $400. That kind of money attracted attention, not all of it positive. The insurance industry in 1960s, Utah had its share of corruption, of agents who cut corners, of companies that operated in gray legal areas. Andrew prided himself on staying clean, on following regulations, on being the kind of salesman who could sleep at night. In the fall of 1963, Andrew had been approached about a business opportunity that made him uncomfortable. A man named Gerald Blackstone, who owned several motels along the highway south of Salt Lake City, including the Desert Rose, wanted to purchase a large business insurance policy. But the details Blackstone wanted, the way he described his business operations, raised red flags. Andrew suspected money laundering, possibly worse. He'd politely declined to write the policy, referring Blackstone to another agent. It was a decision that may have cost him his life. On the evening of October 11, 1963, Andrew had dinner with his family as usual. Carol made meatloaf, Michael's favorite, and they sat around the kitchen table talking about their day. Andrew mentioned he had an important meeting the next evening, Saturday, with a potential client who wanted to discuss a significant commercial policy. It could be a major commission, he told Carol, might help them afford the down payment on a bigger house they'd been considering. He kissed Carol goodnight after watching the Dick Van Dyke Show together, checked on Michael, who was already asleep, and went to bed, planning for the next day. He had no way of knowing he had less than 24 hours left to live. October 12th, 1963, was a Saturday, unseasonably warm for mid-October in Utah, with temperatures reaching into the low 70s under clear blue skies. Andrew had a leisurely morning, playing with Michael in the backyard, helping Carol with some gardening. Around 2 p.m., he mentioned he needed to prepare for his evening meeting. He showered, put on one of his best suits, a charcoal gray number with thin pinstripes, white shirt, burgundy tie. He looked sharp, professional, ready to close a big deal. At 5:30 p.m., Andrew kissed Carol goodbye, ruffled Michael's hair, and walked out to the garage where his Plymouth Fury waited. The car was his pride and joy, a Sport Fury model in brilliant red with a white interior, push-button automatic transmission, and a powerful V8 engine. He'd bought it new in February 1963, paying cash from his commissions, and he maintained it obsessively, washing and waxing it every weekend. Carol watched from the doorway as Andrew backed out of the driveway and drove away, waving. That was the last time she ever saw him. The meeting, according to what Andrew had told Carol, was at 7 p.m. at a restaurant on State Street. He expected to be home by 9:30 p.m. at the latest. When 10 p.m. came and went, with no Andrew and no phone call, Carol began to worry. By 11 p.m., she was calling the restaurant. They had no record of any reservation under Andrew's name, hadn't seen anyone matching his description. At midnight, Carol called the police. The Salt Lake City Police Department took a missing person report, but, as was common in 1963, they weren't immediately alarmed. Andrew was an adult man who'd left home of his own volition. Maybe the meeting had run late. Maybe he'd stopped for drinks with the client. Maybe he'd had car trouble. Give it until morning, they suggested. But morning came, and Andrew didn't. Sunday, October 13th, dawned cold and gray, the temperature dropping 30 degrees overnight as a storm system moved through. Carol called everyone she could think of. Andrew's colleagues at Mountain States Insurance, his friends, his clients, anyone who might know where he was or who he was meeting. No one had any information. The supposed client whose name Andrew had mentioned, a Mr. Richard Walsh, didn't exist in any business directory Carol could find. By Sunday afternoon, the police were taking the case more seriously. Andrew Johnson wasn't the type to just disappear. He had a good job, a loving family, no financial troubles, no known enemies. His disappearance made no sense. Detectives began investigating, starting with Andrew's movements on October 12th. They discovered that Andrew had made several phone calls from his office on Friday, October 11th. One was to a number that was unlisted, untraceable with 1963 technology. Another was to Mountain States Insurance Headquarters in Denver, though what that call concerned couldn't be determined. The Saturday meeting itself was mysterious. Andrew had written the appointment in his desk calendar. 7 p.m., Walsh, Desert Rose, but there was no address, no phone number, no other details. The Desert Rose Motel, when investigators checked, was a small establishment on Highway 89, about 15 miles south of Salt Lake City. The owner, Gerald Blackstone, claimed he knew nothing about any meeting. He hadn't seen Andrew Johnson, didn't know anyone named Richard Walsh, and had no idea why his motel would be mentioned. Detectives searched the motel property, found nothing suspicious, and had no grounds to investigate further. Andrew's Plymouth Fury was nowhere to be found. An all-points bulletin was issued for the distinctive red Sport Fury, with Utah plates 4H7293. Police checked every parking lot, every side street, every possible location. Highway patrol officers looked along routes Andrew might have taken. The car had simply vanished, as completely as the man himself. The IDAR investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed Andrew's clients, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge, any deals gone wrong, any reason someone would want to harm him. They found nothing. Andrew was well-liked, honest, successful. If he'd made enemies, he'd done so without anyone noticing. Financial records were examined. Andrew's bank accounts showed regular deposits consistent with his salary and commissions. No unusual withdrawals, no signs of financial stress that might suggest gambling debts or other problems. His life insurance policy, ironically, was fully paid up. Carol would receive a payout if Andrew was declared legally dead, but that process would take years. Theories emerged, as they always do. Some suggested Andrew had been the victim of a random crime, a robbery gone wrong, perhaps encountering criminals who'd stolen his car and killed him to prevent identification. But Andrew's wallet, with nearly $200 in cash, was still in the house. He'd left without it, unusual for a business meeting. Others wondered if Andrew had discovered something he shouldn't have, stumbled onto criminal activity, and been silenced. The insurance industry in 1963 Utah had connections to various legitimate and less legitimate business operations. Maybe Andrew had seen something, known something, that made him a threat. The darkest theory, one that Carol refused to consider, was that Andrew had staged his own disappearance. Maybe he had secret debts, secret problems, a secret life. Maybe he'd driven away that Saturday evening and simply kept driving, abandoning his family for reasons unknown. But this theory never gained traction. Andrew had shown no signs of wanting to leave. He'd been planning their future, not running from it. As October turned to November and November to December, the investigation slowly wound down. There were no new leads, no breaks in the case. The red Plymouth Fury remained unfound. Andrew Johnson remained missing. The file stayed open technically, but in practical terms, the case was cold. Carol Johnson faced an impossible situation. She was a 28-year-old widow, though not legally since Andrew wasn't confirmed dead. She had a 3-year-old son, a mortgage, and no income. Andrew's company provided some assistance, advancing her money against his eventual life insurance payout. Family helped, friends helped, the church helped. She went back to work, secretarial jobs that paid a fraction of what Andrew had earned, piecing together a survival that was nothing like the future they'd planned. Michael grew up with fragments of memory and fading photographs of his father. The energetic 3-year-old became a quiet, serious boy who asked questions his mother couldn't answer. Where did Daddy go? When is he coming back? Why did he leave us? Carol did her best to explain the unexplainable, to help her son understand that his father hadn't left willingly, that something terrible had happened that they might never know what. The 1960s turned into the 1970s, and Salt Lake City changed dramatically. The population boomed. The highways expanded. Old motels like the Desert Rose struggled to compete with modern chains. Gerald Blackstone sold the property in 1975 to a developer who had plans that never materialized. The motel limped along under various owners through the 1980s, gradually declining, falling into disrepair. By the early 1990s, the Desert Rose Motel was abandoned, its rooms empty, its pool drained and cracked, its neon sign dark. The property sat on what had become valuable land, but title issues and environmental concerns prevented development. It became a local eyesore, occasionally tagged with graffiti, rumored to be haunted, avoided by all but the most desperate or the most curious. Carol Johnson lived her entire adult life not knowing what happened to her husband. She never remarried, though she had opportunities. Part of her, irrational but immovable, still felt married to Andrew. She couldn't move on without closure. She worked until retirement, raised Michael alone, watched him graduate high school in 1978, college in 1982, build his own life and career. She became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother, aging gracefully but always carrying the weight of that October night when Andrew drove away. She died in 2000, 18 at age 83, in a nursing home in Murray, surrounded by family but still without answers. Michael held her hand as she passed, and her last words were about Andrew. "Tell him I waited," she whispered. "Tell him I never stopped waiting." Michael Johnson was 64 years old in 2024, a retired accountant living in Sandy, Utah. He had vague memories of his father, more like dreams than concrete recollections. A man's laugh, strong arms lifting him, the idhuwa smell of aftershave. But mostly what he remembered was absence, the hole in his life where a father should have been. He'd spent decades occasionally searching for information, checking databases as technology improved, hoping for a break that never came. And then, on April 15, 2024, he received a phone call from the Salt Lake City Police Department Cold Case Unit. The demolition of the Desert Rose Motel property had been scheduled for months as part of the Riverside Development Project, a massive mixed-use complex planned for the area. The motel building itself came down easily, but clearing the back lot required deep excavation to create underground parking. That's when Carlos Mendoza's excavator hit something 12 feet down. The recovery operation took 3 days. The Plymouth Fury had been buried in what was essentially a hand-dug pit, large enough to accommodate the car, positioned behind the motel where the property backed up against undeveloped land, that in 1963 would have been completely isolated. The car had been driven or pushed into the pit, nose first, at an angle, then buried with filled dirt that had been carefully compacted to avoid detection. The burial had been professional, requiring time, equipment, and knowledge of the property. This wasn't a panicked criminal hiding evidence. This was methodical, planned, executed with the resources of someone who knew they wouldn't be disturbed and who had the means to move significant amounts of earth. The Plymouth Fury itself was remarkably preserved despite 61 years underground. The Utah soil, dry and alkaline, had prevented the complete rust-through that would occur in wetter climates. The paint was faded and the chrome corroded, but the structure was largely intact. The interior was destroyed by moisture and time, but the trunk, sealed more tightly, had protected what was inside. The remains in the trunk were identified through dental records as Andrew Johnson. The forensic analysis revealed details that transformed this from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Andrew hadn't died in the trunk. He'd been killed elsewhere, likely shot based on damage to skeletal remains, then placed in the trunk post-mortem. The car had been used as both a transport vehicle and a coffin. Inside the trunk with Andrew's remains were his wallet, confirming Carol's statement that he'd left without it, meaning someone had returned to the house after his death to retrieve it. There was also a briefcase containing insurance documents, business cards, and, most tellingly, a handwritten note in Andrew's writing, Blackstone, Desert Rose, 7 p.m. Confirm policy details. The note confirmed what investigators had long suspected, but couldn't prove. Andrew's disappearance was connected to Gerald Blackstone and the Desert Rose Motel. But Blackstone had died in 1987, taking whatever he knew to the grave. The investigation in 2024 had to piece together what happened from old evidence and limited witness accounts. What emerged was a picture of Gerald Blackstone as more than just a motel owner. Investigation of old FBI files, declassified in recent years, revealed that Blackstone had been under surveillance in the early 1960s for suspected involvement in various illegal activities. The Desert Rose and his other properties were believed to be fronts for money laundering operations connected to organized crime figures from Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Andrew Johnson, in his capacity as an insurance agent, had apparently stumbled into this world. His refusal to write insurance policies for Blackstone's questionable operations had made him a problem. The meeting on October 12, 1963, may have been a setup from the beginning. Andrew had been lured to the Desert Rose, killed, and buried on the property where Blackstone had complete control and where no one would think to look. The burial itself would have required several people and heavy equipment, likely a backhoe or similar machine. Blackstone owned such equipment for motel maintenance. The work could have been done at night, when the motel had few or no guests, on property where Blackstone's word was law. The red Plymouth Fury, so distinctive and so likely to be found if abandoned anywhere public, was simply removed from existence, buried deep enough that casual digging would never reveal it. For 61 years, the secret held. Blackstone died without confessing. Anyone else involved either died or kept silent. The Desert Rose Motel changed hands several times, but the back lot where the car was buried was never developed, never excavated deeply enough to reveal what was hidden there. Andrew Johnson became a cold case, a mystery, a sad story that older Salt Lake City residents would occasionally mention. Until progress, in the form of the Riverside Development Project, demanded excavation deep enough to uncover what had been buried. Michael Johnson stood at the edge of the excavation site on April 18, 2024, watching as the Plymouth Fury was carefully extracted from the earth. He was seeing his father's car for the first time in his memory. A ghost made solid, tangible evidence of a crime that had shaped his entire life. Tears streamed down his face as he watched. "I never stopped looking for answers," he told reporters who'd gathered to cover the story. "My mother died not knowing, but at least now we know. He didn't leave us. He was taken from us. That matters. That makes all the difference." The investigation, now a homicide case being handled jointly by Salt Lake City Police and the FBI given the potential organized crime connections, faced the challenge of investigating a 61-year-old murder where most principals were dead. Gerald Blackstone couldn't be prosecuted. Witnesses who might have seen something in 1963 were in their 80s or 90s if still alive, their memories unreliable or gone entirely. But the investigation did uncover some new information. Former employees of the Desert Rose, tracked down through old tax records and interviews with elderly locals, provided statements. One woman, 89 years old in 2024, remembered working the front desk in 1963. She recalled Blackstone ordering staff to stay away from the back lot for several days in mid-October, claiming there was dangerous construction work happening. She'd seen heavy equipment running at night, heard Blackstone on the phone speaking in angry, hushed tones. Another witness, a former business associate of Blackstone's who was 92, provided information that Blackstone had been worried about an insurance agent who was asking too many questions and refusing to cooperate. The witness claiming he'd had no idea what Blackstone ultimately did, said the motel owner had connections to organized crime figures who could handle problems when needed. None of this amounted to prosecutable evidence. The people who might have testified against Blackstone or his associates were dead or protected by the statute of limitations on any crimes they might have committed. The murder itself had no statute of limitations, but the murderer was dead. So, what really happened on October 12, 1963? Based on evidence and investigation, the most likely scenario is this. Andrew Johnson drove to the Desert Rose Motel for what he thought was a legitimate business meeting. Instead, he was confronted by Blackstone and possibly associates, people who saw Andrew's refusal to provide insurance coverage as both an insult and a threat. Perhaps they tried to pressure him, to force his cooperation. When Andrew refused or threatened to report illegal activities, he was killed. His body was placed in the trunk of his own car, and that night, using equipment Blackstone owned, the car was buried in a pre-dug pit on the motel property. The burial would have taken hours, multiple people, significant effort. But for Blackstone, it solved multiple problems. It eliminated Andrew, disposed of evidence, and made the car disappear completely. The wallet was retrieved from Andrew's house, possibly by someone who knew where Andrew lived or who broke in while Carol and Michael were asleep or away, to make it seem like Andrew had taken it with him, supporting a theory that he'd left voluntarily. The plan worked perfectly for 61 years. Only the inevitable march of development, of progress, of a city growing beyond its 1960s boundaries finally revealed the truth. Andrew Johnson was buried with full honors in May 2024, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people, some who remembered him, most who knew him only as a story, a symbol of all the unsolved crimes that time eventually brings to light. Michael Johnson, 64 years old, finally laid his father to rest beside his mother in a cemetery overlooking the valley Andrew had loved. The Plymouth Fury, after forensic examination was complete, was restored by a group of classic car enthusiasts who worked with the Johnson family. It will eventually be displayed in a Utah museum, a memorial to Andrew and a reminder of the crime that took his life. The case is officially closed as solved, though no one living will face prosecution. Andrew Johnson was murdered by Gerald Blackstone or his associates on October 12, 1963, his body buried along with his car on the Desert Rose Motel property. The motive was likely Andrew's refusal to participate in illegal business operations, his potential as a witness against Blackstone's criminal enterprises. But questions remain. Who helped Blackstone bury the car? Were there other victims? Other cars? Other secrets buried around Utah? The Desert Rose property has been completely excavated now, and nothing else was found. But what about Blackstone's other properties? What about the dozens of other motels and businesses that lined Utah highways in the 1960s, many now demolished or abandoned? The case of Andrew Johnson stands as a reminder that beneath the surface of American prosperity, beneath the cheerful facade of mid-century optimism, there were always darker currents. Organized crime, corruption, violence existed alongside drive-in movies and suburban dreams. And sometimes, those who stood up against it, those who refused to participate, paid the ultimate price. Andrew Johnson was 31 years old when he was murdered for having principles, for refusing to look the other way, for trying to do his job honestly in a world that didn't always reward honesty. He deserved better than to spend 61 years in the trunk of his car, buried behind a seedy motel, forgotten by everyone except the family that loved him. But at least now his story is known. At least now, justice, however incomplete and however delayed, has acknowledged that a crime occurred. At least now, Michael Johnson can visit his father's grave and tell him what his mother wanted him to know, that they waited, that they never stopped waiting, that they never stopped loving him. If you have information about unsolved disappearances in Utah or anywhere else, especially from the 1960s and 1970s, authorities encourage you to come forward. Modern technology and modern investigative techniques have made it possible to solve cases that previous generations couldn't. Every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. Andrew Johnson got his answers, 61 years too late, but still meaningful. His life mattered. His principles mattered. His family's grief mattered. And his story, finally told in full, serves as both a memorial to a good man and a warning that crimes, no matter how well hidden, no matter how deep they're buried, can still come to light.